Hey Bobby, this is Dr. B, and I thought I'd make some comments while I watch your presentation for the very first time here. So off we go.
And its development and use throughout history. And pictured over here is a molecule of hydroxychloroquine.
Okay, a few things that I really like. Very professional looking slides. Number one, chemical structure, wonderful. Number two, there's the hydroxy group, there's the chlorine, nice. Um, Screencast-O-Matic, I wonder how that worked out for you. I think it's a very good system to use. I'm using the professional version right now to make these comments, which has this cool background removal thing that I'm using for the first time. I'm wondering how it's coming out. Oh, and I do notice that your timing's fine. You're well over 5 minutes.
So the drug hydroxychloroquine
Well, I like this. You are going way back. You're right. So it's originally an anti-malarial, coming from quinine, which came from the cinchona tree, and the cow. Oh wow, nobody went this far back. So here we go.
can be traced back to the drug quinine, which was the predecessor to chloroquine, which was the predecessor to hydroxychloroquine. And the first recorded use of quinine was when it was part of this cinchona bark.
So important note: if you're somewhere and you contract malaria, just start chewing on the bark of a cinchona tree. Good to know.
Came from a cinchona tree, and it was used to treat malaria when the Peruvian Countess of Cinchona had.
Or better yet, go to your local 7-Eleven and get some tonic water. I drink it myself. I like the taste. And what does it say? Contains quinine.
Malaria. She contacted Incan herbalists to find a remedy for malaria, and they brought her this, and it was effective. And it became popular, this bark, as a treatment for malaria. And then later, the tree and the bark were named for her. They didn't just happen to have the same name.
Nice detail.
So later, quinine was isolated from the cinchona bark, and around.
Yeah, much later. That's not an easy thing to do, to take that bark and from it isolate quinine itself. So let's see what they do.
This first happened with the Countess of Cinchona in 1638, and it was not for over 200 years that quinine was isolated and used on its own as.
Not surprising. They just don't know how to do it. Now, what is this structure here? This one I do not recognize. So that's quinine itself. How do you like that? Arguably a more complex structure. Look at this interesting bicyclic species here. And I wonder why they had to change this part of it here.
The treatment. And here is a picture, a drawing, a two-dimensional drawing of a quinine molecule, and this in this.
I guess I would call it a three-dimensional drawing since it does have the wedges and the hatches, but no big deal.
This form was used for hundreds of years or at least more than 100 years, as the main treatment for malaria in the world, although it did have some toxic side effects.
There you go. Now you're getting into why they had to tweak the structure. They call this a structure-activity relationship.
Especially when used too often or in too great amounts. Mainly vision loss being.
Now you got me nervous about drinking that tonic water.
The main risk of side effect, with also a possibility of possible heart problems.
Yikes.
So later, this was somehow this drug, chloroquine, was derived from quinine. I couldn't find any specific.
Now, this is what I did for a living for like 10 years. It's usually pretty simple. You have some way you can test if it's getting better or worse. It's oftentimes nowadays just a cell line, and you see how it affects this cell line. Usually what you're looking for is more potency. If you can get more potency, you almost always can reduce the toxicity since you're taking so little that it's not a big deal. You can take the opposite approach and just do tests for keeping the same potency, but making it less toxic. And there's ways you can do that. So you just start tweaking the structure, change this, remove this methoxy group, put something down at this position, change this whole thing. Can you see how it's still got the amine, but it's a couple carbons shifted? This thing here, if you drew it in the form of a six-membered ring, you could see how it bears some resemblance. So the topology is still pretty similar. But so this would probably be World War II era, my guess, of people playing around with the structure to try to make it better.
Specific information saying how this process happened, but I'm guessing it has to do something with the addition of the chlorine atom, which is not present in the quinine. But it was around World War II that chloroquine
World War II, very good.
became popular because it had less side effects, slightly less side effects, less toxic effects, and it was also cheaper and easier to make. So
good point. Oh, I wonder if it's just easiest just to like grab that bark and just come out with tons that way. In any event,
chloroquine during World War II became or surpassed quinine in popularity for malaria treatment. And then a few years after that, this chloroquine was hydroxylated and turned into hydroxychloroquine by the simple addition of an OH anion. As you can see here, that's the only thing differing between these two structures. It was the addition of hydroxide.
Yeah, and they probably...
And here we have the chemical structure.
Yeah, and they probably just did that to improve water solubility.
A chemical formula and chemical structure of hydroxychloroquine, which is C18H26ClN3O. And hydroxychloroquine is usually administered with sulfuric acid, combined with sulfuric acid.
I think what you're saying there is that rather than being the free amine, it is turned into the quaternary ammonium salt in terms of as an ammonium sulfate. When you take something that's not ionic and you turn it into a salt, in this case a sulfate salt, you would just improve its water solubility. And so it does not have any sulfuric acid in it. It's just removed from the free base and turned into the quaternary ammonium salt. There was another comment that I wanted to make about this. Oh yeah, normally these molecular formulas are pretty meaningless, but there is one thing that medicinal chemists do care very much about, and that is if you're going to make this thing a pill, it's been observed over and over that you got to keep the molecular weight below about 500. This became known as one of Lipinski's rule of 5. And what are you at here? Well, each carbon's worth 12, so 120, 240 minus a little, call it 220, 120. Yeah, you're going to be well under 500, so no reason to believe this can't be a pill. So it is small enough, so good.
Which is H2SO4, and it is then called hydroxychloroquine sulfate. And it should be noted that hydroxychloroquine was created as an improvement on chloroquine because it had less toxic side effects.
You know, that could very well be. I always think that whenever I see hydroxy, just make it get into the bloodstream better, make it more water soluble, but who knows? Sure, less toxic, wonderful.
Though there's still a small risk for them. On April 18th, 1955, the FDA approved the use of hydroxychloroquine.
Deep research, Bobby. Very good. 1955, 65 years ago. Long time.
Sulfate to the company Concordia Pharmaceuticals.
Ooh.
Under the brand name Plaquenil. And Concordia then began producing it and selling it.
And my guess would be that Concordia was bought out hook, line, and sinker by some other giant pharmaceutical company.
A treatment for malaria, lupus, and rheumatoid arthritis, being the main uses for it.
I wonder if it was the blockbuster drug of the day.
So these three main diseases plus offshoots of these three main diseases. And for a long time, Concordia was the only company that had FDA approval to use it. But then starting in 1994, there were several other companies that got approval and also started manufacturing it.
Now, typically what happens, and now 1955, the rules might have been a little different back then, but the way it works nowadays is if you invent it and you can patent it, you get one generation of coverage, which is 17 and a half years. So they're good until 1973 or so, at which point it would go off patent. Anybody can make it, and it goes generic, and the price usually drops by 90% at that point. And Concordia can no longer profit from it, although there's tricks that they can do to try to do so anyhow. And so good. I like this.
So now since 1994, now 14 more companies have obtained FDA approval to create hydroxychloroquine sulfate and sell it.
As a generic drug maker.
In 2013, the World Health Organization added hydroxychloroquine to its list of essential medicines, which they send to the whole world as the medicines which are most necessary, most safe, and most effective for use in any sophisticated medical system. So hydroxychloroquine was added in 2013, and it is still there today, and it replaced quinine, which came before it, because of its more toxic effects, though chloroquine, as you can see, is still here. They redo this list every 2 years, and this is the most recent edition featuring both chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine.
That's interesting. Their list of essential medicines. I wonder if that is some over the counter, some not. And yeah, that's a cool list.
And then this
Are you getting political now, Dr. Rick Bright? Let's see where this is going.
year, moving on to the COVID-19 pandemic, on March 28th of this year, there was an emergency use authorization approved by the FDA for the administering of hydroxychloroquine sulfate, but only in the setting of being administered by a healthcare provider, and if the drug came from the strategic national stockpile, which I'm sure.
You definitely got my attention here. Let me take a look at this. So I'm familiar with Rick Bright in the news. And what is he doing? Let me pause for a sec. Okay, so this is a letter to Dr. Bright in response to his request for the emergency use. Now, my understanding, based on reading some other presentations, is that, yeah, HCQ did get this is just chloro. Okay, HCQ did get approved for emergency use based on some anecdotal and early study information, and it's unclear to me whether they had to pull it off afterwards or whether it's still on that emergency use list.
You've been hearing a lot about recently, but this allows individual doctors to prescribe hydroxychloroquine to their patients if they think that it would be wise in their treatment of COVID-19, although no large-scale studies have been done proving its effectiveness.
Yeah, so I think you're acknowledging that it was approved for emergency use, and there are political ramifications to this.
And then, to reinforce what they said in March, this came out on April 24th, an extra caution from the FDA warning against the use of hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine outside.
Really? Now, this is the question I was wondering about. They approved the emergency use, then all these further studies come out saying, maybe you shouldn't have done that. And so instead of rescinding it, they instead are going to put out a caution. Boy, I think that they should just rescind its use for COVID-19. Cautions against the use. Is that the same thing as saying it's no longer approved for emergency use? Right? Now, and I think it's fine to say this is still fine for malaria, lupus, and arthritis, but
Of a hospital setting, saying that they're possible. What it says, QT prolonging medicines when combined with azithromycin or these medicines, there was possibilities for heart problems, especially.
QT prolongation was something we always had to look at when we were going through phase 1 and phase 2 development of drugs. This is a very common heart arrhythmia that happens so often with drugs that are being tested, and it's just a generic thing that you always have to check for, and it sounds like this got caught by that.
especially in people with histories of heart problems. Although generally, for the other uses like malaria and lupus that it's been used for hundreds of years, it is still a safe drug if prescribed by a doctor and used safely. Thank you.
You know, it does make me think as to how dangerous is this, right? Quinine's present in tonic water. It's been used for hundreds of years. Um, and yet, they're saying for COVID-19, it's not necessarily something you want to do. I don't know what percent of this is political and what percent of this is real, but these heart rhythm problems and actual deaths that have occurred during these studies, I guess it makes me say that using HCQ for COVID-19 is something you just should not do. Okay, Bobby, as for all these presentations, I talk about a few things I like, a few things that you might consider doing next time, and your overall grade. In terms of the things that I liked, I love the professional nature of your presentation. I like the picture-in-picture thing that I'm doing, and I think you might want to consider doing it later, only because it just gives, I think people like it. Um, I really liked, and perhaps this is the thing I like the most, is your in-depth study. The hallmark of a really good presentation is one where the listener is learning new things despite their level of interest, and I absolutely was learning new things as you presented this information. In terms of the history, that I haven't seen a presentation yet that goes back further, right? What was her name? Count Kinchona, right? Queen Kinchona. That was fun. And so kudos to you for that. I honestly don't have a lot in terms of negative comments to make. Usually, where a lot of the students fall short is when they show the chemical structure and they simply say, yeah, that's the chemical structure. Okay, moving on. But I saw you make a bold attempt to do an SAR study, structure activity relationship study between the quinine that's present in the bark and the modified. You pointed out that the hydroxyl group decreases toxicity, which is something I did not know. So really, that's another compliment that your depth of investigation is really good. If it's a kind of field you want to go into deeper, you should be aware that that's where the chemist really focuses 90% of their effort is into the chemical structure and how it relates with the host, right? We're talking about a receptor being antagonized or agonized, and in terms of the toxic functionalities, you want to dial those out. You can use the power theory of making it so potent that if you can go from milligrams to nanograms in terms of the delivery amount, you're almost certainly going to eliminate toxicity issues because it's simply so potent. Having said that, that approach did not work for the company that I worked for, and they went out of business. So moving on to your scores, I am giving you full scores across all topics. College level investigation, absolutely, including a depth of study that rarely I see. Inspiring, I think so. It's your topic delved into political arenas and you remained neutral and focused on the science, which I like. Fascinating. Oh yeah, I think that the history is fascinating, going through World War II and up to the present day, right up to this slide that I'm looking at now, which only came out perhaps a couple weeks ago, where the FDA kind of, I think, shot themselves in the foot in that they initiated the emergency treatment, and now they had to say, maybe you better not. And you got the president himself taking it weekly, I guess. Not bullet pointed. No, not at all. I like the method of showing actual text when accounted for, and timing was good. So 50 out of 50. Great job, Bobby.